So let's dive into our discussion of subversive ethics. And as you can see from the text, there's a lot of material to cover here, both in subversive and ecclesial ethics. As you can see from the text, um, subversive ethics are going to focus on categories such as class, race, gender, disability, and age. So these are kinds of classes that of persons that might be familiar to you from things like the civil rights movement and so on. Indeed, some branches of subversive ethics, as we'll talk about a little bit, do resonate with the civil rights movement in the United States. But as you can also see from the text, a lot of subversive ethics are generated really from Latin America and Central America and Africa and other places outside the United States. Although certainly this kind of theme of the particular location of persons is really important for subversive ethics. So when we think about this category of class, we would include within that category questions about poverty, questions about power, economics, class struggle. When you hear terms like that, you would rightly be thinking, wow, this sounds like the kind of language that, let's say, Marxism would use. And that's correct. A lot of subversive ethics draws on themes from Marxism and other kinds of economic frameworks such as that. Not necessarily all subversive ethics, but some subversive ethics certainly does that. Race, of course, we are speaking about really primarily how certain races historically have been oppressed, or races or nationalities or ethnicities. And certainly there is a large category of Black theology, African theology, and so on that is very focused on these categories. Gender will include feminist theologies, womanist theologies. It will also include a category called queer theology. So it includes not only gender of male and female, it also includes the question of, more broadly, of sexuality. And then, of course, disability and age. There's really a growing body of literature, in particular on Christian ethics and Christian theology of disability. Now, another term that you need to be kind of familiar with from subversive ethics is this question of praxis. So one of the main themes of subversive ethics is this idea that theology and theological ethics ought to really focus on the lived lives of actual people and the practices through which such people can live their lives, and through which the church and society can exist in relation to these people. So the notion here is that the universal category of ethics that we looked at last week very often tends to be oppressive. As you can see when you look back at that category, the thinkers who historically developed that category are the canon of dead white males, so to speak, running all the way from the Greeks through the church fathers to the present day. And so that universal category of ethics is developed really in many ways in opposition to others such as women or racial minorities and the like. So in many ways, subversive ethics is going to push back against classical universal ethics. Now, as the text indicates, it's not necessarily the case that subversive ethics denies any kind of universality to ethics, because in some respects, subversive ethics come up with their own kind of universal imperatives. So, for example, you hear in some subversive ethics, some liberationist theologies, the idea of the preferential option for the poor. Well, if the preferential option for the poor is a valid way of constructing and thinking about ethics, that in itself is a universal principle. In fact, it begins to sound very much like a Kantian categorical imperative. So it's not necessarily that there are no universal principles, but it's that whatever kinds of principles are drawn out of this struggle with these kinds of categories, bumping up against the assumed universal elite. This idea of struggle we also see very present in many kinds of subversive ethics, and we'll often use the term dialectic. And this is a term that goes back to Hegel. And the notion here is that within the tension, within the back and forth, the give and take, the yes and the no, so to speak, that friction in itself produces creative possibilities. And now it can produce negative possibilities, but even within those negative possibilities can produce kind of the fruits of change, and can produce sort of the new practices, the new praxis that leads to the possibility of change. So on this screen, just showing a bunch of different categories of what we might call subversive ethics, and a number of these categories would fall under what we might call liberation theologies. Other categories might not totally fall under liberation theologies, but might borrow elements of that. But I think one of the things that this screen illustrates is that all subversive ethics, or what our text is calling subversive ethics, are forms of contextual theologies, or grow out of contextual theologies. So if we take, for example, African American theology, and our text goes through a number of key figures, such as Booker T. Washington, Nat Turner, W.E.B. Du Bois, and various other figures. Some of these figures, kind of pre-Civil War abolitionist figures, and in fact, we can, I think, trace the roots of a lot of these theologies all the way back, of course, to slavery in America, and to the African American slaves who developed their own forms of Christianity, of Christian practice, very often, encoding in their songs, encoding in their informal liturgies, not only sort of their worship service, but also ways of speaking to each other that their masters might not understand or appreciate, and so on. So you see kind of the roots of some of those theologies, and in particular, I think you see the text mentions that for all of these subversive ethics, there are some biblical concepts and stories and passages that are really key, including the story of the Exodus. So the story of the Exodus in Scripture, the story of God's people being enslaved and of God setting them free, certainly is a touchstone of early and contemporary African American theology, and informs an ethic of freedom, of liberation. We mentioned the Latin American liberation theologians. They have been and they remain extremely important interlocutors in theological ethics. The book mentions the Minyoung theologians, who are Korean theologians speaking about classes of Korean people. The book also mentions African theologies, meaning continental Africa, and Dalit and Caribbean theologies. I think one of the things that's interesting about these categories of theologians and subversive theological ethics is that they're developing a Christian theological ethic from within a context that was Christianized, so to speak, initially by white Western missionaries. And when you take a history of Christianity class, if you take that class with me, we spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the early church in Africa, which has really fascinating, very early roots. But then the later colonial period in the 19th century, 18th, 19th, 20th century, missions movements, which are, um, white, English, North American, to a large extent, missionary movements, um, and kind of importing not only um, thoughts about Christianity and the Christian faith and scripture, but also thoughts about society and culture and race, and of course, bringing along with that forms of European colonialism. So a lot of these theologies are reacting against that colonialism in very interesting ways. Of course, we have also here South African subversive ethics arising out of the experience of apartheid, and we have feminist and queer subversive ethics put up here as well. The feminist category is very interesting, and the text goes through a number of ways in which there are a variety of kinds of feminist theologies. Kind of just ranging from a sort of reading of scripture and reading of history, trying to emphasize some important women. So, for example, we might look at the biblical text and look at figures like Hagar or Tamar or other figures in Scripture who are important, Deborah, important women in Scripture, and kind of just bring out those themes. And we might go to a kind of even kind of stronger or more thoroughgoing womanist kind of theology that really even looks at the categories of the Trinity and other things like that, and can kind of go through a broad range of different perspectives. And then we also list here this question of queer theology. There are some very important voices writing today who are looking at gender and sexuality and the kind of presumed norms of gender and sexuality that are read out of or read into the biblical text, and trying to question those critically and perhaps even in some respects rewrite those. Now, one of the themes that I mentioned in subversive ethics is this idea of really pushing back against and often rejecting the universal narrative. And along with that, you'll also hear this term, a hermeneutic of suspicion. And the idea with the hermeneutic of suspicion is that, to be critical and suspicious of what is received wisdom. And in particular, if it's received wisdom from the intellectual tradition of the West, which is again, just historically a largely male, largely European and white tradition, and that includes the Christian tradition, to suspect that aspect of the tradition, to question it, to ask whether there are other perspectives that have been left out. Now, as you read through this chapter and you see some of these categories that we've put up on the screen and that we've talked about, these categories of ethics in some ways I think have almost entered the mainstream, so to speak. So if we think of African American subversive ethics, and one of the great leading figures, of course, is Martin Luther King Jr. And I think outside of some really radical circles these days, I think just about everyone universally recognizes the value of Martin Luther King Jr.'s thought, the brilliance of his words. Not everyone's going to agree on, all of the legal ramifications of every aspect of the civil rights movement, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find very many even white male Christian theologians working today that would say there shouldn't be equal civil rights for white and black people and so on. So that in a sense has entered the mainstream, but I think you can see that a lot of these other categories have not entered the mainstream, and indeed are often very much pushing against the boundaries of what we might consider sort of basic orthodoxy, and that includes things like how we think about the Trinity, how we think about the identity of God. So, I think these are extremely valuable and important categories and lenses for us to look at. They are also categories and lenses that we ourselves want to kind of look at and try to think through critically as we look at all of the sources of Christian theology and of theological ethics altogether. As we look at try to look at the whole of the Christian tradition, even as we are willing to critique it and reform it, and look at the whole of Scripture and look at philosophy or reason and try and do the best we can to draw all of these strands together.